away from the election, and there's a lot of information out there. Here are 3 things you need to know from the Bipartisan Policy Center. 1. There will be a surge in voting by mail, which is safe and secure. And 2. You likely won't know who won on election night, since it will take longer to count all the ballots and report the results. And finally, your usual polling site might be different to keep you and poll workers safe. Check out canivote.org if you're not sure where to go. By planning ahead and knowing what to expect, you can make sure your voice is heard at the ballot box.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event. Appreciate you spending a little time with our video on voting. The BPC believes that key to a participatory democracy is actually participation, and we are looking to encourage the engagement with the franchise at every opportunity. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce today's event, which is the discussion of this terrific book, Girl in the Photograph, a true story of a Native American girl lost and found in America. And I guess there's 2 reasons why I'm really happy to be here. The first is Byron Dorgan. There is nothing that the Bipartisan Policy Center would not do for Byron. He has been a senior fellow of ours for a decade. He has led a number of different projects, and he's just one of the most incredibly thoughtful, deliberate, decent people that you could ever hope to meet. And so when we heard Byron was doing a book, we said, let us have an event, with no idea what the book was about. The second reason I'm delighted to be here is I've actually read the book. This is a uniquely important book, and I think there are 3 things about it that I find really distinct. The first is this is one of the first times someone's come to the BPC and written a book that's not about themselves. This is a book about a woman named Tamara, who is an incredibly resilient person who we can all learn a lot from. But the style of political books is usually one that is far more self-reflective, self-congratulatory. And I think anyone who knows Byron will understand that that's not his imagination about how to make the world a better place. I think that's quite important. The second is that this is a story. You know, one of the things that I learned from Byron and others is that the key to good politics is good storytelling. Byron's a terrific storyteller. And I think by kind of humanizing and making kind of the larger issues here so real and so intimate, we've created an opportunity to really have a much deeper kind of conversation than often happens. And then the third reason that I'm really impressed with this book is it is shockingly gutting and optimistic at the same time. I think this book is somehow makes it possible to be a hard read that you really can't put down. It is a book that I think reveals a lot of what is not working well in our society, but it is done in a way that makes one eager to engage and be part of the solution. And I think when we look at all of the incredible structural challenges facing this country, it is the ability to look at those problems with wide eyes and at the same time with the confidence and spirit that we can make the world a little better. And so this is a really good book. Let me do a slightly more formal introduction of our 2 speakers, and then I will turn it over. So Senator Byron Dorgan, a congressman and a senator from North Dakota for 30 years. He left voluntarily, I should stress, in 2011. During his time in the Senate, he spent 16 years in leadership roles. Importantly, for the purpose of today's discussion, he chaired the Senate Indian Affairs Committee in the last 4 years of his time in the Senate, from 2007 to 2011. And he, since leaving the Senate, has founded the Center for Native American Youth, which is housed at the Aspen Institute. So that's a quick story about Byron. I will also tell you that he started his political career as a tax collector. So it's only been up since then. We are also delighted to have with us Christy Wildcat. And what's going to make this program, I think, really special is that Byron has found a way to engage some of the optimism that the book foretells actually in the program itself. Christy is of the Northern Arapaho tribe, which is located in the central Wind River, Wyoming, central Wyoming, Wind River Reservation. She was the 2016 Center for Native American Youth Champion for Change. She is currently pursuing a graduate degree in anthropology at the University of Wyoming. And I believe she has a hard stop because she has a class shortly after this event. She is an incredibly accomplished young woman. She is the recipient of a McNair and Cobell Scholarship, and is going to help us for the next 45 minutes or so, learn about this book. So I will turn it over, Christy, to you and to Byron.
Alrighty, thank you so much. Before we start, Byron, do you have anything before we jump into the questions?
Well, Christy, thanks for being with us today. I should add perhaps as well a bit about you, scholar, athlete. You're going to be one of the Native American leaders in the future. And there's actually a small piece in the book about you as well. But to Jason, let me say, Jason, thank you very much for introducing us. And thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center, which I'm enormously impressed with, happy to be a part of. And someday, of course, we'll get back to a better kind of politics in America where things can work for the benefit of the American people, and the sooner the better. So, Christy, let me do this. Let me start by kind of telling the story, and then let's go from there. And I'll do that maybe for 8 or 10 minutes, and then you can pump me with some questions or pester me with questions, and we'll talk about the rest. So let me ask you all a question who have tuned into this. Have you ever seen something or heard something that you just can't get out of your mind? You know, something that you knew or you saw, you heard, and then you just can't put it aside. No matter how you try, you just can't put it aside. Let me tell you something that happened to me 30 years ago. And I want to show you a photograph. This photograph is of a beautiful young girl, age 4 and 5 there. Her name is Tamara. And I saw this February 4th, 1990. I know this newspaper looks kind of yellowish here because I've had it for 30 years. Had it in my desk drawer. I've never been able to get it quite out of my mind. This beautiful young girl with a tear running down her cheek. And I want to read to you what it says under her photograph. It says, Tamara, severely beaten, now cowers in the dark, humming TV jingles. Yeah, I've had a lot of trouble putting this aside. And so the day that I saw it, February 4th, 1990, I decided I've got to find out what happened to Tamara and to these other children who were beaten in foster care homes. The very next weekend, I left Washington, D.C. to go back to my home state of North Dakota, and I went right to the Indian reservation. And I met with Tamara and her grandfather. And I went into a room, and her grandfather was seated, and Tamara was on his knee. She didn't seem to really recognize or understand that there was someone else in the room even. She stared vacantly into the abyss, and she just didn't have much life to her. And we talked, and then I raised hell with everybody I could raise hell with the tribe, with social services, with foster home officials, to find out how is it that a young girl can be severely beaten, and somehow nobody seems to be angry or upset about it. Nobody is charged with anything. Let me tell you what happened to her. Tamara was taken away from her parents. The book describes as the newspaper, and Tamara does. Her mother was an abusive alcoholic, and she was taken from her parents and put in a foster home. In that foster home, at a drunken party on a Saturday night, this young girl was beaten severely. Her leg was broken, her arm was broken, her nose was broken, and her hair pulled out at the roots. And then she lay in an empty room for several days with no medical attention. And finally, at long, long last, there were knocks on the door by social service folks from the tribe demanding to see this young child. They'd been there before and were turned away. This time they wouldn't leave, and they saw this young child and saw what had happened to her and took her directly to a hospital. So that's the story of this young girl named Tamara at a very young age. I met with her and her grandfather, as I said, on a Saturday on the Indian reservation. I sent Tamara a couple of Christmas gifts, stuffed animals and so on. And then her grandfather died, and I lost track of her. And when I would go to the Indian reservation following that, I would ask people, does anyone know what happened to this young girl that had been beaten in the foster home? And I used her name. Anybody have any knowledge of where she is and what has happened to her? No one knew a thing. No one. And I never learned what might have become of Tamara. This 30-year-old newspaper, I had it in my desk drawer, never took it out of my right desk drawer, just kept it there. And when I'd open that drawer, somehow I'd see this photograph, and I'd keep coming back to it. 27 years later, out of the blue, I received an email from someone named Tamara. I sent an email back, and I thought to myself, this is really unusual. I said, is Reginald your grandfather's name? Are you the Tamara from the Standing Rock Reservation? And she wrote back and said, yes. And here's how she had contacted me. Tamara was homeless in Minneapolis at the time. She had no knowledge of her youth, really. She had very little memory of what had happened to her, very little knowledge of her youth. And so she went to a library and used a computer to try to find out with a search engine what might be there about her. Would she find something about what might have happened? And what did she find? She found a speech that I had given on the floor of the United States Senate. And that was using her name. And she found it. She found my interest, and she emailed me. I went to Minneapolis, met with her, had lengthy discussions with her, and she has had quite a remarkable life. She's been homeless for a long while. She described to me what had happened. She has attempted to take her life several times. She has just had a very difficult life. She suffers from PTSD as a result of the severe beating. She has suffered rape, sexual indiscretions, and so on. And so Tamara has been through it all. And she once told me, and in Minneapolis during the winter, homeless people would look for a handicap porta potty, because a handicap porta potty is bigger and you can stretch out to protect yourself from the wind and the severe cold. She told me things that I'd never even thought about, what had happened to her and how it happened. But then something else happened to her. She met a man named Ronald Russell, who was a church-going guy in St. Paul, and his church cared a lot about homelessness. And he saw her talking to some other people one day on the street. He sort of knew she was probably homeless. And he talked to her and he asked her if she would like a job. And it was being an attendant at the women's bathroom in a nightclub. And Tamara said, yes, I'd like to do that. And so she did. This Ronald Russell went out and purchased some clothes for her at a Goodwill, because she didn't have any clothes to go to a job site. And one night at that job site, she was only there about 2 months. One night, it was late. They'd worked late, and she was going to walk home. And Ronald said, I'm going to take you home. I don't want you walking at night on the streets of Minneapolis. I worry about you. She said, no, I'm fine. At any rate, he persisted and just kept persisting. And finally, she got in the car with Ronald Russell. And they began driving, and he said, where do you live? And she said, just let me off up here at an intersection. And he said, well, I'm going to take you where you live. And she said, no, just let me off. And then she finally told him, I'm homeless. And she said, but just let me off. And she was living under a bridge, as a matter of fact, at the time. And he said, well, I'm not letting you off. I'm taking you to the Salvation Army. She said, well, I'm not going to the Salvation Army. He said, well, that's fine. We're going to sit there all night in front of the Salvation Army then, because I'm not leaving until I see you walk through the door. And Tamara walked through the door, finally, stubbornly, at long last. And as she walked up the walk to that door, she thought to herself, I'm not very many blocks away from the bridge where my friends are sleeping. She walked into the Salvation Army, and she was there a year and a half. And she met a woman named Kate Sherva, who took a special interest in her. And that became the change in her life. Two people she didn't know, Ronald Russell and Kate Sherva, that began promoting the kind of change that could help her deal with her issues moving forward. Since that time, she has gotten some housing assistance. She's gotten some financial assistance. She continues to have PSD, nightmares. But she's taking some medicine, and she's doing better. She's a smart, aggressive young lady, a survivor, someone I have great admiration for. And so why this book? Because she agreed with me. I wanted to tell her story. And she said, if this can help other Indian children, I hope you'll do that. And so I did it. Too many Native American children are first Americans living in third world conditions for education, healthcare, and more. And that is not fair. But that's the reason for the book. And so, Christy, that kind of gives a bit of the story of who she is, how I found her. 27 years later, I get an email from this wonderful young woman who has survived and has been through great and difficult times.
Thank you for that. It's really a strong story, and it's really powerful, to hear about it and to hear about this personal story of Tamara. And it really made me feel a lot of things while I read the book. But let's jump into some questions. We already have a couple in from Carolyn Cooper. I'll read this one off for you. What are some of the barriers that are stopping Native Americans from becoming politically involved, and how can we remove them?
Well, interestingly enough, Native Americans are very interested in politics. I mean, they've tried to be involved. But as you know, most reservations are far from population centers. Many reservations are very rural in nature. Many of them have far too few polling places. And also, what we have discovered is North Dakota is a good example. The state legislature in North Dakota took action to try to make it very hard, or if not impossible, for Native Americans to vote. They did that because Native Americans traditionally vote more Democratic than Republican. And so too many legislators are making it very hard for people to cast their votes. Now, let me just say to you, it is interesting that the situation with respect to Native Americans, they weren't allowed to vote until 1924. I mean, over the first half of our country, they couldn't vote. They were not considered voting citizens. So now they can vote, but as I've indicated, there are too many legislatures and others that have made it too difficult for Native Americans to vote.
Thank you for that answer. Next question. So in the book, you mentioned the wonderful Eloise Cobell. You wrote about her in your book as well. Can you give your take on her?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I heard you say that you are a Cobell scholar. Is that right?
Yes, I am. And it's such a big honor to be one as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to, if y'all don't mind, I want to talk about Eloise Cobell. I love Eloise Cobell. She passed away. We lost Eloise, but she was a remarkable woman. She's a Blackfeet tribe in Montana. And Eloise was a woman that was enormously strong. And she saw people on the tribe, on tribal land. She saw people living in abject poverty. I mean, unbelievable poverty. She described a woman who was living in this one-room tar paper shack, looking out of cracked windows, and she would see 4 and 5 oil wells pumping oil from her land. And she lived in poverty because she didn't get a cent for it. Not a cent. And so, Eloise asked the question, what in the hell is going on? How is it you can drill for oil on Indian land, and somehow the person living next to the oil well, whose land is theirs, is living in poverty? And what she discovered was the trustee accounts at the U.S. Department of Interior that were supposed to be keeping track of these funds for minerals and so on and so forth. They weren't keeping track of it at all. Some were stealing, some were just incompetent, and they couldn't find the accounts, the records, stuck in warehouses covered with dust. It was unbelievable what Eloise discovered. Eloise Cobell sued the federal government. She just sued them, and it took 15 years. And she used to come to Washington. She testified a lot before our committee, and she came to Washington. I remember her telling me once, there's senators that really won't see me anymore because they're tired of me. And I said, well, Eloise, whenever you come to Washington, I'm your senator. You come see me. And ultimately, at long last, Eloise won her suit, $3 billion. $3 billion. And a portion of that, it wasn't money for her. It was money that was going to go to Native Americans, to the tribes, and to the people. And what happened ultimately is that it resulted, in addition to other things, the Cobell scholarships that you are studying under. I mean, it's what a wonderful thing, investing in the education of young Native Americans with the Cobell scholarships. And I'm going to tell you one more story. And I'm just telling you just because I think it's interesting. I know Eloise would not mind. God rest her soul. She told me one day when she was in my Senate office, she said, most people don't know this of me, but she said, I'm president of the Montana Elvis Presley fan club. And I said, oh, really? And I was unable to go because I didn't know she had passed away. I knew she had cancer, but she passed away, and I was not notified of a funeral, and I didn't get to Montana, or I would have certainly been there. But I'm told that in the gymnasium where she laid in rest, they also, over the loudspeaker during this period, as people came to visit her, were playing Elvis Presley music. And I'm sure this wonderful, strong, powerful woman named Eloise Cobell would have appreciated that gesture at her funeral. But what a remarkable woman.
I'd have to agree with that. She's definitely one of my role models, especially when it comes to Native American education. But thank you. On to the next. You have described circumstances where Native American children are living in third world conditions. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is they're living in abject poverty in many cases. Just, there's no other way to describe it. I mean, you go to some of these Indian reservations, and what you will see is unbelievable unemployment. The reservations are far from population centers. There's very little industry, very few jobs available. And the healthcare is horrible in most cases on these reservations, despite the fact that, we had promised Native Americans in treaty, and we signed the treaties. We had promised them we were going to provide for their health care, but many of those promises didn't mean very much. And so many of these young children are living in conditions that you would find in other parts of the world that you would call third world conditions. I visited the Pine Ridge Reservation, and when I was at Pine Ridge, which is, a reservation where the tribal council is struggling very hard to find a way to put the pieces back together on many of these issues. And I was at the school, and I had a little roundtable discussion with some kids at the high school. And there were these two young boys that I've not forgotten. And the young boys said that they were just telling me something that they thought was kind of interesting in their lives. They said, our school doesn't have any money. Our school just is desperately poor. And they said, we are both wrestlers, high school wrestlers. And we went and wrestled at the regional tournament and won. So we were eligible to go to the state wrestling tournament in Rapid City, South Dakota. But he said, the school didn't have any money. The school said, we can't send you to your state tournament. And they said, but we had a wrestling coach. We have a wrestling coach named Dave Marchand. And Dave said, what? If the school won't help us, we're going to find a way to do it ourselves. The two boys said, Dave bought us new wrestling uniforms, and then he paid for the gas in his car, and we drove to Rapid City, and we asked those that were running the wrestling tournament if we could sleep in the gymnasium where the tournament was held. They said yes, and so we did. And so we made it to the state tournament. And Dave, the wrestling coach, said, I know that it was kind of something different for them to sleep in the gymnasium, but they didn't. It wasn't a big deal to them because they were wrestlers. They were champions that came from their region, and they were wrestling in the state tournament. And Dave said, I wasn't going to let them miss that. And those are the kind of stories you hear. But my point is, there's great poverty in some of these areas, and these kids that live in that poverty are very often hungry. They don't have the right kind of shelter. The teen suicide, the rates of teen suicide is dramatic, which is one of the reasons I started the Center for Native American Youth when I left the Congress. I wanted all the lights all the spotlights to shine on the same spot, Native American youth. I think they are some of the most left behind populations in America. And so as I was thinking, what do we do to address this issue of Native Americans? One of the two great stains, in my judgment, on the conscience of our country is slavery, and also the treatment of Native Americans. And as I thought about how do we begin to address that, it occurred to me, begin with the children. And so that's why I wanted to put all the spotlights on this one spot, Native American youth, to try to improve their lives, to try to help those children, to raise the issues that they face, and see if our country doesn't have the capability, finally, at long last, to address those issues.
Oh,
and so,
wow. Thanks.
Christy,
sorry.
I want you to tell me about this scholarship. You applied for the scholarship, the Cobell scholarship, and you're now studying for your master's degree, I understand. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. I just remember hearing about the Cobell, or Eloise Cobell, and her whole case in my freshman year of college, and I had no clue. So I did all of my research on her, and just right out of the gate, she was amazing and phenomenal. And so I reached out to my mom. I said, like, have you heard of her? And my mom's like, yeah, and you haven't?
Yeah. Well, she was
so I learned about scholarship, and I applied. Yeah, amazing.
I think I'm losing you here, Christy. Can you ask that again?
Oh. Yeah, no problem. I was just going on about my applying for the Cobell and just being blown away by it and how it's helped so many Native students out. But speaking of questions, we actually have quite a few in from Stephanie Mole. She'd like to congratulate you for this wonderful book. She says she's so glad to know what happened to Tamara, but she wants to know how to help Tamara and others.
Well, Stephanie, Tamara is doing better, and well, I've arranged over time to create close to where Tamara lives, to create opportunities to get some help for her PTSD. She has not ever been quite ready to open all those wounds, but even at that, she's doing much better, and she's a smart, aggressive young woman. I'll tell you a little about her hobbies. She has an acuity for foreign language, and she watches on the internet Japanese movies and is learning Japanese, studying Japanese and learning Japanese by watching movies. She's a smart, bright young lady, and my hope is that she'll be able to find a way to deal with the other health issues that still exist, and find some opportunities ahead of her as well. But Stephanie, you asked the question about how can you be helpful. If you don't mind, let me quote Joseph Marshall. Joseph Marshall III is an Indian historian, and he was speaking to a crowd at the Colorado University in the evening, and he, at one point, as he was speaking to this crowd about Native Americans, someone raised their hand, was gestating wildly, and they stood up and they said to Joseph, I don't understand. I just don't understand. Isn't this about your ancestors and my ancestors? And if so, why do you describe me somehow as responsible, as accountable? Why do you think I'm accountable for this? And Joseph Marshall looked at him and said, because you know the story. Because you know the story. And when you know the story of an injustice, you have a responsibility to help. You have a responsibility to address it. That's very simple. To Stephanie and others, we know this story now. And the question of how the Congress, the question of how policymakers begin to finally discover that they have broken so many treaties and turned their back on Native Americans in terms of what was required, I should say, in terms of what was promised them. I don't need to go far with respect to the history of this, except to say, I know that the Native Americans owned the Black Hills of South Dakota. It was a very spiritual place for Native Americans. And the Fort Laramie Treaty provided the language that said this belongs to the Northern Sioux tribes. And it took General Custer and a little bit of gold, and pretty soon the federal government, they just stole that property. Now the Native Americans went to court, and the court said, yes, the federal government stole that property, and here's $1 billion. Native Americans have not cashed that $1 billion. It sits in an account somewhere. And because to them, this is a spiritual place, and they shouldn't have lost it. And so, there's so much of this that has gone on that the history, I could talk a little about the history of the Dawes Act and the other issues, the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson rather. So we'll get to a couple more questions, Christy. I'm sorry, I'm talking more than listening.
No, that is totally fine. So the next question is, you talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline. Can you give us a quick take on that?
That was the gathering of, I think, up to 10,000 Native Americans between North and South Dakota and the Standing Rock Reservation. And that area, it was a very, very large reservation. I think it's about the size of Connecticut. It's a very large reservation. And the Missouri River runs through that reservation. And so Dakota Access Pipeline was a pipeline, and it was going to be built. And they originally were going to move that pipeline across the river, under the river, I should say, north of Bismarck, North Dakota. And then the company that was moving that pipeline or building the pipe decided to move it to just north of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. In fact, it is actually on the Indian reservation that used to exist. The federal government, of course, took part of it away, and the Indians have never agreed with that. So it's a mile north of the new reservation, but it's on the old reservation. And so they decided to build it anyway. And of course, it caused unbelievable controversy. And this went on for a long while. There were about 10,000 people that gathered there. And it should have caused controversy, because the Native Americans told the company they were opposed to having it built there. And there was a requirement for there to be the kind of discussion and capability to negotiate with the tribe, and they didn't do it. And the company decided they can proceed anyway. And of course now it's in the court system, and it's been stopped at the moment. I mean, the pipeline is built, but they're not moving property there. So it was a pretty awful situation with 10,000 people gathering. I can tell you about Bobby Jean Three Legs, 24 years old, member of the reservation. She lived just south of the reservation in South Dakota. But Bobby Jean Three Legs had a little baby, a little girl, and she thought about this issue of water and what would happen if that pipe that was going under the Missouri River just north of Fort Yates, North Dakota, what would happen if that pipe burst? What would happen to her and her child? And she decided, I'm going to get involved here. And she wasn't a runner, but she decided, well, maybe I can run. So she ran a 13-mile thing and got a bunch of her friends to go with them. And then she drove up to Standing Rock, and she decided, I'm going to run from the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota to Omaha, Nebraska. And so she got some people to run with her. And they submitted the petition to the Corps of Engineers saying, we oppose this pipeline. And then she got back and she decided, you know what, let's run to Washington, D.C. And so they ran, she and her friends ran from the Standing Rock Indian Reservation to Washington, D.C. and sent their petition. And by the way, in the middle of that journey, the Corps of Engineers then had already decided they were going to allow the pipeline to be built. But as I said to you, now it's in the courts. But the reason I mentioned Bobby Jean Three Legs is, she just got involved. She decided, I'm going to be a part of trying to make a difference on what's happening to me and to my people. And I've written about her in the book as well.
Wow. I remember my younger sister and a few of my cousins actually ran with a young gentleman. I'm blanking on his name, but they did the same thing and they ran a few miles for him so he could rest. And it was just an amazing thing. But we actually have a couple questions in from Corin
Okay.
King. She asked, with so little representation in the federal government, how can we ensure Native American voices are heard when policy decisions are being made?
Well, we are not very effective at that, and we have to change that. And one of the ways is to elect people who tell you that they're going to solve some of these problems. Let me just tell you the story about healthcare then, if you might. We tried for 15 years to get passed in the House and Senate a bill called the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. The Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. We tried for 15 years and couldn't get it done. The last year I served in the Senate, I was chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee. I got it done. I got it done permanently, so it's permanently reauthorized. But let me tell you how I got it done. I put it in the Affordable Care Act. And the Affordable Care Act, as you know, was that big, the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, big piece of healthcare legislation. And we had passed the bill in the Senate. We were on the floor almost 2 weeks and debating, and we passed it in the Senate. And so it became a Senate number bill that the Senate agreed with. So then we're going to pass the Affordable Care Act. And I had told the president, and I also told the leadership, Senator Reid, I said, you know, I'm in favor of the Affordable Care Act, but I'm not voting yes unless you include the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. We've passed it in the Senate. And it's been 15 years. You need to include it. And they said, well, you know, that's 180 pages or whatever it was. We can't put another 180 pages in here at the last minute. I said, it's not the last minute. I told you a long time ago that I wasn't going to vote for this bill unless it includes the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And so they finally included it in the Affordable Care Act, but it's included in a way that has only been done a couple other times in history, I believe, where they create a reference to a Senate numbered bill, and the specific language in all of that bill is becoming a part of the underlying Affordable Care Act. That's the way it was done. It was not reprinted in the Affordable Care Act. Now, the reason I tell you that story is, you know, the Affordable Care Act is in front of the Supreme Court. In fact, there's discussions today about this new justice going to the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court would strike down the Affordable Care Act, they will strike down the permanent reauthorization of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act as well. So we have a lot riding on this. All of us do in our country, but especially Native Americans as well. It's really important that the Supreme Court do the right thing here and support the Affordable Care Act and support the inclusion of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act.
Wow. Thank you for the answer. Next question we have is, can you describe some remarkable work that is being done by Native youth?
Yeah, well, I mean, I described, Christy, that you're in this book, and part of it's the work that you have done on the Wind River with respect to the Wind River tribe and the misinformation that exists between Indians and non-Indians, and you've tried to bridge that gap in very significant ways. But let me, since you talk about inspiration, this book was hard to write, and it's also a hard story to tell because there are a lot of bad things here, you know, of what has happened to Tamara and other children. So let me talk about some people that are doing some inspiring things, because I think there's a new generation of leaders, yourself included, who are doing extraordinary things. I'll tell you about Dakota Brown. So Dakota is a young Native American in California, and he was playing on his football team. He was in early high school, playing on his football team, and he was playing with kids that he knew were as smart as he was, but were getting D's and F's and going to get kicked off the football team. And particularly the star, you know, the star runner, right? And so Dakota went to him and said, listen, I will stay after school an hour a day, every day with you and study. I want you to continue to be in our school and playing football with you and so on. So he started, and he got one of the football players to decide, okay, we're going to do this. So then they decided, okay, after a week or so, it worked pretty well. They decided, we'll invite some other kids. And And then they decided, well, let's create a club. And so they created a club. And they named the club NERDS, Native Education Raising Dedicated Students. Think of that, NERDS, right? And so they got a bunch of kids come in, and Dakota Brown, every night after school, would spend that extra time, and they would all study together. And there was a young girl, I think her name was Angela, who joined. She was in 8th grade. And by the way, she was listed as a slow learner. And she just recently graduated from high school with a 4.0. And these kids that were getting C's and D's and F's began getting B's and C's and passing grades and staying in school, all because of the idea of this young kid named Dakota Brown. And then he took it to a couple other schools as well, and it was just as successful there. NERDS, Native Education Raising Dedicated Students. And by the way, now Dakota Brown is at Stanford. And I think it's probably his last year at Stanford. What a remarkable young man. I tell that story just because I want people to understand, yeah, there's a lot of bad news out there, but there's also some wonderful news as well. I mean, really, really good news. And Mariah Gladstone from the Blackfeet tribe, I think she has her master's degree from Columbia. And then, she's working, and she's doing something called Indige Kitchen, because when she grew up on the Blackfeet reservation, they were eating fresh meat and grains and fruits and things. And then many of the tribes were moved off the reservation because of water projects and so on. And so now she's trying to talk about nutrition with the Native Americans, and it's called Indige Kitchen. And she's been on YouTube and elsewhere at TED Talks talking about how you prepare food and how you provide good health to Native Americans. And she's just a remarkable. Thanks for that question, by the way. I love to talk about these kids that are doing some extraordinary things.
Of course, and I know both of them, and they're phenomenal people as well. Like, I'm just honored just to know them. We have a question from Bill Hoagland. The question asks, we hear discussion about reparation payments to African Americans. Why shouldn't there be a similar discussion for First Americans?
Well, I think if there were any reparation payments to anyone, it would have to start with First Americans. But I don't know what's going to become of those issues. There's no question, however, that any reparation discussion really must include First Americans. As I've indicated, they didn't get the right to vote until the very end. And there were still some states in the 1940s that were not allowing them to vote. So, Native Americans were here first. We all know the story of Plymouth and so on, and they welcomed the Pilgrims. And the first couple of horrible winters, they cooperated with the Pilgrims that came off the Mayflower. But the fact is, for a long, long time, they have discovered that they have been moved and displaced. They ultimately, when there became a government in our country, they produced something called the Northwest Ordinance in our government. And the Northwest Ordinance passed by the Congress said, look, we understand Native Americans were here first, and we intend to live with them, and we don't intend to take their property. It was a wonderful thing to have done, the Northwest Ordinance. And then what happened is the Indian Removal Act under President Andrew Jackson. The Indian Removal Act was passed by the Senate by one vote, and that resulted in the Trail of Tears, where the marching of these unbelievable Native Americans, many, many, many of whom died through these horrible marches in the winter, and it became called the Trail of Tears. What a horrible, horrible story in our country's history. And so we've been through a lot, and I think, I mentioned the Black Hills and the Fort Laramie Treaty, and, all the things that have been promised and then subsequently denied. If there are reparation payments that are going to be made in this country, reparation payments need to include First Americans as well.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I agree. Next question is, what is CNAY and why did you create it? Could you explain like what CNAY does and also include Champions for Change?
Yeah, CNAY is called the Center for Native American Youth, and I should say cnay.org to those who would like to tune in and see what we're doing. Nikki Patry is the director of it. She is doing an excellent job. When I left the Senate, as Jason said, voluntarily, it's true, but I was there. I was up there 30 years, 12 years in the House and 18 years in the Senate. And I really did think I wanted to do some other things. I've now written 5 books. This is the 5th. This book about the girl in the photograph, and so I wanted to do other things. I taught. I was an adjunct visiting professor at Georgetown University for about 6 years after I left. In addition to writing and serving on boards of directors of various things, and serving as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I've done a lot of things. And all the things I wanted to do. But I also wanted to be involved and stay involved in issues dealing with Native Americans. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe did a ceremony and bestowed me with an Indian name, and it's called Shante Unwiaka. And Shante Unwiaka means thinks with his heart. And I believe with all my heart that we understand there has been a substantial amount of racism that exists with Native Americans in this country for a long, long, long time. We understand there has been economic deprivation, substantial poverty, the inability to get the kind of health care most other Americans have at their beck and call. It's interesting to me and sad that the federal government has a requirement to provide health care for American Indians. That requirement exists because we promised them and we signed the treaties to promise them. Now, we also have a requirement to provide health care for those who are incarcerated in federal prisons. We spend almost twice as much per person to provide health care for federal prisoners as we do for Native Americans. I mean, that's a stunning admission on the part of this country, and wrong. And so I think the Center for Native American Youth is an organization that's designed to focus on young Native Americans just because they are the future. And what we're trying to do is to deal with the 2 big issues when I created this were teen suicide prevention, because we had unbelievable clusters of teen suicides, and we still have some, and also education opportunity, because I really believe education represents the steps in and out of poverty and the steps up towards opportunity. And so we now are doing youth engagement projects and a wide range of things like that. And we created something called the Champions for Change. And we did that just because I wanted tribes to nominate candidates of young people who are on their reservations, who they think are future leaders, who are doing extraordinary things and making a difference. And so we get the nominations in and we select 5 a year, and they are the Champions for Change. And Christy, of course, you were one of those champions. And it is a great program, and one that I think offers a lot of spirit to what we're trying to do at the Center for Native American Youth.
Thank you. Yes, Champions for Change all the way. It's a wonderful family to be a part of. So from here, we'll kick it over to some audience questions. So we have a couple that came in. So we have another one from Corrine. It asked, what role do you think Native American youth should play in political advocacy?
Well, I'm a big believer in making sure everybody plays an aggressive role, and that's especially true for Native American youth because, they are the ones that have been left behind. I'm talking about now education. Take a look at the studies that describe the conditions of BIA-sponsored schools, and you'll see that they're not up to standard. Healthcare, not up to standard. So, and the issue of living in poverty and living in violence is so. I believe Native American youth should be very aggressive and very well organized to say we're not willing to accept this. This is not something that we're willing to ignore and accept. We are determined to change it. And how do you change it? You change it by being involved in the political system and electing men and women who have decided that they can make a difference on these key issues. I'm really proud that we have 2 new Native Americans in the last couple of years elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. We had a U.S. Senator who was Native American in the United States Senate, Ben Nighthorse Campbell. But not enough Native Americans are seeking office and being successful in seeking office. But I want young people to be involved, aggressively involved.
I agree. More representation, I feel. So we have another question from Peter Angood. The question says, HRSA oversees much of the Native American Healthcare Improvement Act, but seems disjointed from mainstream healthcare. How do we correct that for further?
Do that again, Christy, if you would.
Yeah, of course. HRSA oversees much of the Native American Healthcare Improvement Act, but it seems disjointed from mainstream healthcare. How do we correct that further?
Well, the simplest answer, and I know it's a tiresome answer, but we think, based on the best evidence that I could find, that there's about 50% of the money that is necessary to provide adequate health care to Native Americans. What that means is they're about 50% short of what is needed. And so what you have then is what's called healthcare rationing. And it doesn't matter what organization is trying to deal with these issues. If you're short half the money you need to address these issues, it's not addressable. You've got to dramatically change it. The stories are so prevalent. I mean, the woman from the 3 affiliated tribes who was having a heart attack and was put in a wheelchair, put in an ambulance, in a wheelchair and then an ambulance, and had a piece of paper taped to her thigh that just said to the hospital, if you admit this woman, we're out of contract healthcare money, so you're on your own. So these kinds of stories about the lack of basic funding for things that most other people take for granted. We had a doctor testify at one point before our committee when I was in the Senate, and the doctor described a woman coming to another doctor who was working in that area, and she had bone on bone in her knee. And it was the most painful. She could barely move her joint because it was just unbelievable pain. And so the doctor prescribed that she should wrap her knee in lettuce leaves. And the doctor, that's just unbelievable. I mean, that's malpractice. But if you live with this unbelievable pain, most people would be able to go to a hospital or a doctor and get surgery and get it fixed. She's told wrap it in lettuce leaves. I mean, that is what too many Native Americans face in a healthcare system that doesn't work. And so what I think is desperately necessary in this circumstance, it needs to be funded at an appropriate level in an appropriate way. And it's also the case, I understand it, so many reservations are far out in the country, and they're not close to major healthcare facilities. And they have the Indian Health Service, which has lots and lots and lots of issues. I can't describe them all to you. I investigated some of them, but they try, but they just don't get the job done. I'm going to just tell you, and I'll do it very quickly, about Tashawn Rain Littlelight, who I've written about in this book. When I passed the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act on the floor of the Senate, finally at long last, it took 15 years, I used a photograph of Tashawn Rain Littlelight, this beautiful 6-year-old girl wearing the dance dress of traditional Indian dance. And she loved to dance. She was a beautiful young girl at age 6. And she became very ill. Her grandmother, held a hearing in Montana, her grandmother walked down the aisle with a big photograph of Tashawn Rain Littlelight, and she was crying as she spoke about her granddaughter. And it turns out her granddaughter was very, very sick, and they took her to the Indian Health Service, and the Indian Health Service says, well, she's depressed, and gave her medicine for depression. It took her a second time, well, she's still depressed, so they gave her more medicine for depression. And finally, they took her to a bigger hospital, and they took some x-rays and other things and couldn't figure out what was going on. And finally, she got desperately ill. They took her to Denver to Children's Hospital, and she had cancer that was that took her life. And she only had a few months to live. The Make-A-Wish Foundation got her to the facility in Florida, where they would take young kids that want to go see the Princess Castle in Disney World or Disneyland. And they got to Shine Rain Little Light to Florida. And the night before she got to see the Princess Castle in Disneyland, she died in her mother's arms. This is a young girl who was desperately ill with terminal cancer and judged to have depression and was getting medicine for depression. And the point, and I've written about her in the book as well, the point of it is we have to do better than that. So as Tamara, as Shine Rain Little Light was very ill, her mother told me that she was watching something on TV and there was a guy on this program, and she asked the mother, is that guy still alive? And the mother said, no, he's dead. And so Tashawn said, but he's still famous. And the mother said, yes. And Tashawn said, well, maybe I'll be famous someday. And so I've written about Tashawn Rain Little Light in my book because it describes why we have so much to do and why we need to do it now for Native Americans. So this book, let me finish, Christy, by doing this. Let me thank you for participating, because I think having Native American youth who I think is destined to become one of our Native American leaders in our country. You're getting your master's, you're going to get your PhD, you're on track, and I'm so impressed with you and the other champions for change. But I just want to finally say that, this is a circumstance where I think it was Martin Luther King talked about bending the moral universe towards justice. Ultimately, as I've mentioned, the two great stains of slavery and the treatment of Native Americans, ultimately our country has to address and deal with these issues. You can't deal with it just piecemeal. You have to address it in a significant way. And the reason I wrote this book is I want everyone who sees this book and hears about this book, I want you to know the story. It is what Joseph Marshall said, because you know the story, and when you know the story of an injustice, we are all responsible for addressing that injustice. And so that's the purpose of this book. And I want to especially thank the Bipartisan Policy Center and Jason, and thank you, Christy, and thanks to the others who were willing to allow themselves to be put in this book. And finally, let me conclude by thanking Tamara. She is a remarkably strong young woman who has survived because she's strong, but she has been through things in her life that very few Americans have ever had to experience. But she still has some hope. And part of that hope, I think, would be because she understands what we have to understand. We know this story. She's willing to tell this story. And when we know that story, we have a responsibility to correct these injustices. And I think we will bend that universe to do that. Anyway, Christy, thank you very much. And thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center.